Happy holidays, everyone. I hope you're staying safe, and I hope that introduction got you very excited for the Guardsman Project. This one's been burning a hole in my back pocket for a little while now, but of course, the start of a new year is the perfect time for the start of a big new hobby project. As you can see, I've gone onto eBay and I've picked up a whole bunch of used Warhammer 40,000 models, and the project is going to consist of taking these models, stripping them down, personalizing them with some sculpting and such, and making of them a Warhammer 40,000 army that I actually like. I've always been a Warhammer fantasy guy more than 40,000. I like the historical aspect of fantasy, and 40,000 I'm not such a huge fan of the, massive guns and everything's bigger in space kind of philosophy. However, the Imperial Guard are the closest thing to a generic science fiction infantry and army force that you can find, and I'm hoping to come up with a paint scheme for them that will allow me to use them in other generic science fiction rules as well. The first step, and I thought this would be a really interesting one to share, is planning out the project. With a big project like this, I wanted to make sure that I came up with a few interesting options and decided on something that would actually satisfy me as I went forward. This is going to be quite time consuming, and it's ideally a little ambitious as well, so I needed to come up with some good ideas to move forward with. To do this, I started up Krita. It is an electronic art program, I guess. I have a drawing pad that I use with it as well, which makes this very handy, but even if you don't, I would recommend doing this for brainstorming up paint schemes, which is what I'm going to be doing here first and foremost. I started out by writing down the goals I had for the project in the upper left corner, just so I had some reminders, and these are pretty simple sort of goals. The first one is I wanted to have more kit on the models, make them look like, they're out campaigning and they've actually got equipment on them, because most of the models I received don't have much by way of backpacks, equipment, or anything like that. I wanted a helmet cover that can break up the silhouette of the Imperial Guardsmen, make them look a little less like the normal Acadians. Have everything look interesting but also realistic as I went forward, because I do want to be able to use them in generic sci-fi games as well as Warhammer 40,000. Although, of course, having an army for Warhammer 40,000 will expand my gaming options quite a bit. A helmet cover just covering up that shape I think will do a lot to break up this very, very standard Acadian model look that they all have. I'm also going to want to stray away from that in the color terms, of course. The green and tan, while it is a color scheme that's quite historical, and I did come up with an idea of making this army look sort of Desert Storm-ish, if you will, I found that look too much like the green and tan of the Acadians, and again, I want to have something personalized and something that's more or less my own, rather than going with one of the standard Warhammer 40,000 paint schemes. So the first thing I wanted to do is brainstorm up some of these helmet covers, some of the first and foremost, covering up the head, and I've mentioned this in a couple of earlier videos, but I do find the head and face to be a very important part of the model. It's the first thing a lot of people will look at on your models, so having something that shakes up the head shape a little bit was really important to me. Starting, of course, with what's most familiar to me, I ended up with helmet scrim for the first option. A helmet scrim being just a sort of netting or webbing over top of a helmet that you add foliage to in order to make it look a little bit more natural in the environment. This is sort of the same idea as a ghillie suit, if you haven't seen helmet scrim before. It's a pretty simple concept, but I was thinking it might look a little historical and be a little interesting that way. For the next one, I wanted to go with something a little more foreign, I guess. That's the mitznefet. It's an Israeli helmet cover. It's largely, I guess it looks like a chef's hat. A lot of people call it that. But I thought it would be a little different and just sort of break up the silhouette. This is a bit of an example of a mitznefet, how it sort of sits. I couldn't find any good pictures of them actually in use. I had seen them in a Vice News documentary at some point, and they sort of caught my eye. And for the last one, I wanted to go full sci-fi with something that I thought would be very interesting, and that's a reflective visor. Now, with the release of Cyberpunk 2077, I'm realizing that that's not a very original idea necessarily, but I did do this planning long before the game actually came out. And the actual inspiration for it was the Hammers Slammers series of short stories by David Drake. I don't know if any of you have read them. They're pretty interesting. He was deployed to Vietnam and wrote a series of short stories based on a science fiction mercenary tank regiment, based off of his experiences in Vietnam at the time. They're an interesting read if you're into sort of military science fiction. With this reflective visor in mind, I figured the third loadout or layout scheme would be the most futuristic and far-fetched one. The middle one would be just pushing a little bit beyond the normal modern style, and the leftmost would be kind of a familiar military look, just to see if that appealed at all. With the mitznefet, I started out by trying out a sort of woodland camouflage on it, but since I figured the scrim would look best in woodland camouflage, I'm going to go back and amend that in a moment. Woodland being, I think, the most logical way to go with this sort of foliaged look for the helmet. Hopefully by showing you this, you're already seeing the kind of advantages you can have by going onto a drawing program of some sort. You can also do this by just printing up black and white pictures, by the way, but I decided to use it digitally because I had the digital tools, and just coloring in things as you go. So here I'm going to color in that Mitznefet over top, and I'm just going to start getting an idea of the shape of the model, and it'll let me brainstorm sort of shades and colors that I want to use. By doing this, I'm effectively creating my own reference material, whereas normally if I were trying to paint something historical or something based on the packaging of a game, someone else has done the work of, picking out some nice complementary colors and creating a reference document that I can look at while I'm painting. In this case, I'm not going to have that because I want to go with something custom, so I'm creating this ahead of time myself. For this central option, since I decided not to go with woodland, I decided on an urban gray and black sort of camouflage. I think the gray and black urban sort of style looks very sci-fi. It does actually reflect that sort of cyberpunk look of the cops in the cities and all that, the militarized forces. But on the other hand, I'm not sure how it'll reflect on the tabletop, which is where painting up some test models will come in very handy. If it ends up being really muddy and not showing any shape because it's all just shades of gray and black, then yeah, it's not going to be much of a hit. But it might be super interesting. For woodland here, I'm going with the classic sort of jungle pattern woodland of greens, browns, and blacks. This is very, very classic military. There's not a lot of creativity there, but that's what the brainstorming is for. We come up with some options that are a little safe and some options that are a little risky, and we'll try them all out. I decided to brighten things up here a little bit because, well, that green was just too dark, simply put. And then I'm going to fill in a rough camouflage pattern over top. This being the sort of more standard one, I'm pretty sure this is going to be an easy one to at least picture in my mind. Painting it on the model is going to be a little bit of a different matter because those colors don't overlay very well on each other. Green and brown, they don't stand out from each other, I guess is what I mean more than that. So it can be a little hard to make the camouflage actually look deliberate and interesting at the scale of a miniature. For the last one, which I was deciding was going to be my most sci-fi, most futuristic option, I decided to try for some sort of multicam pattern, which is to say a pattern that is intended to work on most environments. For that, I decided to go with grays and beiges. Beiges add a little bit of warmth and a little bit of color to the design. Same with a little bit of a reddish tone. This will all make it a little more poppy, if you will. It'll make it stand out a little bit more, hopefully, but also reflect a sort of camouflage that might make sense for a, star-hopping military force that has to fight on various different planets. Much as the same way as modern militaries go with multicams to save money, I could imagine that this regiment of the Imperial Guard would go with a multicam pattern so that they don't have to keep printing out new camouflage for their forces on different planets with different climates. Not that, as I understand the Warhammer 40,000 lore, they would put a lot of work into camouflaging their troops, but I'd like to picture this as a military force with at least a degree of competence instead of just painting up cannon fodder. That just seems a little bit like a waste to me. For the armor, I picked colors that were a little darker than the battle dress on all of the models. That pretty much invariably to me makes it stand out a little bit better. If you pick a lighter color for the armor, for me anyway, it doesn't look quite as nice. So with the last one, that's a darkish tan versus the light gray that is the base of the armor camouflage. And for the other ones, it's a black and a dark green. Finally, for the boots themselves and the rifles, I'm going to stick with rifles and boots all being black. I think a black rifle just makes sense. You don't want something that's particularly reflective, giving away your position, he says, with a reflective visor on his last model. But yeah, black is very classic. It just looks like a gun if it's black. We'll see when I'm painting the miniatures if that turns out to be way too boring. I should be able to highlight them a little bit with a lighter color. But something just standard and sort of dark and plasticky is perfectly fine for the rifles for me. I also decided at this point that I was going to want to mess with the silhouette a little bit more than I already had for this futuristic model and shorten down the rifle, something more carbine-sized instead of this massive musket that the Imperial Guard carry. Might make a little more sense if you're having to pack into, I don't know, spaceships and stuff like that and travel quite a lot. I know they're all supposed to be laser weapons, but I like the idea of a weapon with projectiles. It just kind of makes sense. And as I understand it, the las guns aren't that good anyway. If I'm not mistaken, their stats are the same as auto guns in the rules. I'm not sure. I haven't really looked into the rules that much yet. I'm just going to prepare everything and hope that it's a reasonable army to play with. I prefer narrative games and historical games in any case, so we'll see how it all shakes out as far as playing Warhammer 40,000. I know there's a lot of people around here who actually do play, and I'm very excited to try it out once this army is fully put together. I also mentioned that I wanted to add more accoutrement to the actual models themselves, so for that I'm adding backpacks to all of them. I want some sort of backpack. It's not really clear to me. Just something to hold their kit while they're out in the field, but not something, you know, not a full-on rucksack that you wouldn't wear into combat, because that's just kind of foolish. So something in the small pack sort of domain. I also want some ammunition pouches and equipment pouches along their waistline. The model that I used here as the backdrop for these test sort of drawings actually has a canteen, ammo pouch, and bayonet there, which is funny. He has a bayonet on his belt and a bayonet on his rifle, so I guess he's doubly ready for close combat. But not all of them come with that, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to sculpt attachments for the vast majority of my models, because they're used models and they come in various states of dress and undress and quality. So planning to sculpt some stuff was, it was already on the list. The colors of those are going to be, once again, complementary to the colors of the camouflage. I want them to stand out a little bit and seem like detail, but I don't want them to, I don't know, take up all of the attention, if that makes any sense. And now, finally, I think I've hit all of my design goals for these guys, and that brings it pretty much to an end for the brainstorm. That was a little fast and furious. I didn't want it to be super long and drawn out, because it was going to be not necessarily painting miniatures, but more sort of a concept that I could show off to you viewers. If you do want more detail on how I did all of this, absolutely ask. Simply put, the pictures themselves are a base primed model in black with a white azimuthal highlight. Just giving them, you know, some definition so that I can take a picture, and so that it's basically black and white and colors overlay well on it in the document. The program itself, as I mentioned earlier, is called Krita, and I'm using it with a Huion tablet so that I can just sort of draw on top of it and it feels very natural. I hope this example of how I brainstormed up the colors was useful. I figured starting the project with the planning phase instead of just starting straight into painting made a lot of sense, because getting into a project can often be one of the most intimidating parts of it. Or at least that's what I find anyway, especially with something like this, where I've got over 100 little models to paint and all this kind of stuff. Before I go into painting 100 of these models, of course, you can expect the next video to be me painting up 3 models in these 3 test paint schemes. I'm going to compare and contrast, and hopefully with your help, I can go ahead and decide which of the 3 paint schemes I'm going to apply to the rest of the army. If this gave you any sort of help for your own projects, or inspired any thought for you, let me know. If you've got a thought on which of these 3 paint schemes you'd prefer, let me know as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you're looking forward to seeing the follow-on of this series as we enter the new year. In the meantime, stay safe, get in touch with those who are important to you over the holidays, via Skype, Google Hangouts, Zoom, something like that. Stay happy, and of course, go play some games.